On August 20, 1968, the Soviet Politburo met to order the invasion of Czechoslovakia and could not assemble a majority. For 8 months, the Kremlin had watched Prague with mounting alarm. Alexander Dubcek had become first secretary of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia on January 5, 1968, replacing the rigid Antonín Novotný, and in April, his party published an action program promising relaxed censorship, economic reform, and a federal restructuring of the state. He called it socialism with a human face, a liberalized but still one-party socialist order. To Walter Ulbricht of East Germany and Władysław Gomułka of Poland, it looked like the first crack in the dam. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. That night, Brezhnev hesitated. He distrusted his general's confidence, feared the cost to détente with the West, and watched Premier Kosygin and others waver. The order never came. The armies massed on the border stood down. But what that silence set loose would take 20 years to fully reveal. Free of occupation, the Czechoslovak Communist Party did something it had been preparing to do in secret. It held its 14th Congress in the open. Delegates confirmed Dubcek and the reform leadership in their posts, ratified the action program, and rejected the hardliners who had quietly begged Moscow for rescue. Ludwig Vakulik's 2,000-words manifesto, published that June, had alarmed the Kremlin by demanding faster change. Now its energy was absorbed into policy rather than crushed by tanks. Relaxed censorship held. Newspapers argued, writers published, and on schedule, in January 1969, the federalization of the Czech and Slovak republics took effect, splitting the unitary state into two national components under one socialist roof. President Ludvík Svoboda kept the army loyal to the government, and Prime Minister Oldrich Kernik managed the economy's first cautious decentralization. It was not harmony. Reformers quarreled over how far and how fast. But the experiment was alive, and the entire bloc was watching. In the history we know, the invasion gave Moscow a principle: the doctrine of limited sovereignty, the claim that the Soviet Union could overrule any socialist state straying from the path. Without the invasion, that doctrine was never proclaimed. There was no Brezhnev Doctrine because there had been no Brezhnev intervention to justify. The Kremlin was left to manage Prague by subtler means: loyalty pledges extracted in private, trade leverage through Comecon, quiet warnings about the limits of tolerance. Dubcek gave Moscow the reassurance it most needed. Czechoslovakia would remain inside the Warsaw Pact and Comecon, unlike Hungary, which had declared neutrality in 1956 and paid for it in blood. That single promise made coexistence bearable. Mikhail Suslov, the party's chief ideologist, drafted careful language about diversity within unity. Yuri Andropov, the KGB chairman who had watched Budapest burn as ambassador in 1956 and had pressed hardest for force, was overruled, and he did not forget it. A reform that survives becomes an argument that travels. East Germany and Poland understood this immediately. Ulbricht tightened travel restrictions and censorship, determined to seal his population from the Prague example, and Gomułka did the same, jamming broadcasts and policing the universities. It was not enough. In December 1970, when workers struck along the Polish-Baltic coast, in Gdansk, Gdynia, and Szczecin, their grievances were no longer only about the price of bread. Their demands explicitly cited the Czechoslovak reforms: consultation, accountable management, an end to rule by decree. Gomułka fell, as he had in the real timeline, but his successor, Edward Gierek, could not buy peace with price rollbacks alone. He was forced to promise consultative changes, structures through which workers could be heard. The hardliners had built a wall against an idea. The idea simply went over it, and in Budapest, a quieter leader saw an opening. János Kadar of Hungary had launched his new economic mechanism in January 1968, a careful loosening of central planning, allowing prices and enterprises some room to respond to demand. In the real history, the shock of the invasion frightened Kadar into slowing it down. Here, with reform no longer treated as treason, he did the opposite. He deepened it. Hungarian and Czechoslovak planners began comparing notes openly, publishing their results, debating which model decentralized power without losing control. What had been a handful of isolated experiments became a bloc-wide conversation about market-influenced socialism, how much autonomy an enterprise could hold, how far a price could float, how a planned economy might borrow the discipline of competition without surrendering its commitments. It was not capitalism, and no one pretended it was. It was an argument the Eastern Bloc was finally permitted to have out loud, and the argument was beginning to reach Moscow itself. By the late 1970s, Leonid Brezhnev was visibly failing. His speech slowed, his grip loosened, and around him a younger generation of Communist Party officials began to think aloud about the future. Their argument was simple and dangerous. If Prague and Budapest could reform and remain socialist, remain loyal, remain inside the alliance, then rigidity was not strength, it was decay. The détente agreements of the decade gave them cover, and so did the Helsinki Accords of 1975, with their language on human contacts and the free flow of ideas. A faction that in the real history stayed silent until the mid-1980s now had permission to speak a decade early. The Soviet succession debate opened ahead of schedule, and it was not only a contest of personalities, it was a contest of models. Reform was no longer a foreign disease to be quarantined. It was a question being asked in the Kremlin's own corridors. By the early 1980s, the ruling parties of the Eastern Bloc began doing something that would have been unthinkable in 1968. They held contested elections within their own ranks. Members chose between candidates, officials defended records. And once the principle of a real choice existed inside the party, it could not be contained there. Cautiously, then openly, several regimes began tolerating non-party candidates for local and consultative bodies. In Poland, where the pressure had built longest, an independent labor movement was legalized rather than crushed. There was no martial law, no midnight arrests, no general driven to suppress his own nation. Instead, the movement was drawn into negotiation, given a seat, a voice, and the responsibility that comes with both. It was slow, partial, and bitterly resisted by those who had everything to lose. Repression did not vanish. It retreated, contested every step of the way. By the mid-1980s, the Warsaw Pact still stood. Founded in 1955, the Soviet-led alliance endured as a security structure, its tanks and treaties intact. But the states inside it no longer governed as they once had. They had become semi-pluralist, reformed socialist systems, one-party rule softened by elections, central planning loosened by markets, censorship worn thin by 2 decades of open argument. The Cold War did not end. The rivalry persisted, the secret police still watched, and the divide across Europe still ran deep. What changed was the manner of the change. There was no sudden collapse, no single year when everything fell at once, no crowds tearing down a wall in a single televised night. Instead, there was convergence, gradual, uneven, and incomplete. A system that had refused one invasion had been forced, slowly, to argue with itself. And in that long argument, not in any single dramatic rupture, the old order quietly gave way.